If someone had told me a year ago that my marriage would fall apart because of a dentist, I'd have laughed. Not because I thought our marriage was perfect, no marriage is, but because the idea seemed ridiculous. My wife, Megan, and I had been together for 8 years, married for 5. We had the picture-perfect suburban life, a cozy house, 2 cars, dinner parties with friends, and vacations we'd post about like we were starring in our own travel documentary, but the cracks were there long before I noticed them. Megan had always been meticulous about her appearance, which I admired. But about 6 months ago, she became obsessed with her smile. She complained about her teeth constantly, even though I thought they were fine. Suddenly, she was booking back-to-back dental appointments with a new dentist, a guy named Dr. Eric Dawson, someone she just heard great things about from a friend. At first, I didn't think much of it. People care about their teeth, right? But then there were other things, subtle shifts that didn't make sense. She'd dress up more for quick checkups, put on lipstick she never wore for me, and come home later than she should for appointments that, frankly, shouldn't take that long. That I asked her about it once, casually. "Don't you think you're seeing the dentist a lot?" She laughed it off. "Oral health is important, James. Maybe you should try it sometime." I chuckled because that's what you do when you don't want to believe something's wrong, but deep down, something felt off. I just didn't know what. Not yet. After that conversation, I tried to push the nagging thoughts aside. Maybe I was overthinking it. Maybe Megan really was just committed to dental health. But the thing about gut feelings? They don't just go away. They linger, quietly tugging at the edges of your mind until you can't ignore them anymore. A couple of weeks later, I came home from work early. It wasn't planned, I just had a rough day at the office and decided to skip the last meeting. As I pulled into the driveway, I noticed Megan's car was already there, which was odd because she had mentioned running errands after her dental appointment. I stepped inside quietly. No TV on. No sounds from the kitchen. Just silence. Then I heard it, a faint laugh coming from upstairs. Megan's laugh. Light, flirty, the kind of laugh she hadn't shared with me in a long time. My chest tightened. I told myself I was being paranoid. Maybe she was on the phone. Maybe she was FaceTiming a friend. Right? But curiosity, or maybe fear, pushed me up the stairs. Our bedroom door was slightly ajar. I crept closer, my heart pounding louder with each step. Through the small gap, I saw just enough. Megan. Sitting on the edge of the bed. Her hand resting on the thigh of Dr. Eric Dawson, who was sitting beside her, still in his work scrubs, his dental tools carelessly tossed on the nightstand like they belonged there. I didn't see them kissing. Not that it mattered. The intimacy, the ease, was enough to tell me everything I needed to know. I stood there, frozen, for a moment that felt like forever. Then, without thinking, I pushed the door open. They both jumped, startled. "Megan," I said, my voice low, controlled. Too controlled for the rage simmering beneath. Didn't know dental checkups came with house calls. Her face went pale, then flushed with a mix of shock and, was that annoyance? Like I was the problem for catching them. Eric stood up awkwardly, clearing his throat. "James, shut up," I snapped, cutting him off without even looking at him. Megan quickly found her voice. "James, it's not what it looks like." I laughed, an empty, bitter sound. "Really?" "Because it looks exactly like what it is." She opened her mouth to speak, but I didn't wait to hear whatever lie she had loaded. I turned, walked out, and slammed the door behind me. I didn't know where I was going. I just knew I couldn't stay, not in that house. Not with her. I don't remember much about the drive after I left the house. My hands were on the wheel, but my mind was somewhere else entirely, a haze of disbelief, anger, and an emptiness that settled deep in my chest. I ended up parked in some random lot, staring at the dashboard, trying to process what had just happened. My wife, Megan, and the damn dentist, Eric Dawson, in our bedroom. The place we'd built our life around, reduced to a backdrop for betrayal that I sat there until the sun started to dip below the horizon, casting long shadows across the cracked pavement. My phone buzzed, snapping me back to reality. It was Megan. "Megan, we need to talk." That I stared at the screen, my thumb hovering over the reply button, heart pounding. Part of me wanted to ignore it, let her stew in whatever mess she'd created. But another part of me needed answers. Needed to hear her say it out loud, to confirm that I wasn't crazy, that what I saw was real. Me, "I'll be home soon." When I pulled back into the driveway, the house looked the same from the outside. But inside, everything felt different. The walls seemed closer, the air heavier. As I walked through the front door, there was Megan, sitting on the couch, pretending like this was just another evening. She had changed out of whatever she'd been wearing earlier, now in a sweatshirt and jeans, like that would somehow erase what I'd seen. She looked up, her face carefully composed. No tears. No apology. Just, blank. "We need to talk," she said again, as if she had any authority over this situation. That I dropped my keys on the table, leaning against the wall with my arms crossed. "Then talk." She took a deep breath, as if preparing for some grand speech. "Look, James, I know what you think you saw, what I think I saw." I cut her off, my voice sharp. "Megan, I didn't walk in on you hosting a book club. I saw you with him. In our bedroom." She flinched slightly but recovered quickly. "It's not like that." "Then what is it like? Enlighten me." She hesitated, then finally said, "It just happened." I laughed, a bitter, hollow sound. "Oh, it just happened? Like tripping over a rug and falling into his lap?" Her jaw tightened. "Don't be dramatic." That word, dramatic, set something off in me. As if I was the unreasonable one here. Dramatic? I took a step closer, my voice low but filled with fury. "I walked in on my wife with another man, Megan. That's not drama. That's reality." She rolled her eyes. Rolled her eyes. "Like I was the problem." "Maybe if you'd paid more attention to me," she snapped, "I wouldn't have needed someone else." There it was, the deflection, the blame shifting. Classic. "Oh, so it's my fault now?" I shot back. I didn't realize not enough attention was grounds for cheating. She stood up, arms crossed defensively. "You've been distant for months, James. Always working late, always tired." I felt invisible. I shook my head, feeling the heat rise in my chest. "And instead of talking to me about it, you decided to screw the dentist?" She didn't respond. Just stood there, staring at me with that cold, detached expression I'd grown to hate in the span of a single day. I grabbed my jacket, heading for the door. "Where are you going?" she called after me. "Anywhere but here," I replied, slamming the door behind me. The cold night air hit me like a slap, but it was nothing compared to the storm raging inside. I didn't know where I was going. I just knew I couldn't stay. I drove aimlessly that night, letting the city lights blur past the windshield like smears of paint on a dark canvas. My hands gripped the steering wheel tighter than necessary, my knuckles white, jaw clenched. I kept replaying the confrontation over and over in my head, Megan's dismissive tone, her deflection, the way she rolled her eyes like I was the inconvenience. Eventually, I found myself parked in front of Ethan's apartment, my best friend since college. I hadn't planned to go there. My car just drifted in that direction, like it knew I needed someone to talk to. I knocked on his door, and when he opened it, his face shifted from casual surprise to immediate concern. "Dude, what's wrong?" I didn't answer right away. I just walked in, sat down on his worn-out couch, and stared at the floor. After a long pause, I finally muttered, "She's cheating on me." Ethan sat down across from me, processing. "Megan?" I nodded. "With who?" I exhaled, a bitter laugh slipping out. "Her dentist." His eyebrows shot up. "Wait, the dentist? Like, the I've got another appointment dentist?" "Yeah. That one." He didn't say anything at first. Just grabbed 2 beers from the fridge, handed me one, and let the silence stretch until I was ready to fill it. I told him everything, the weird dental appointments, the changes in Megan's behavior, the moment I walked in on them. I didn't leave anything out. It felt good to say it out loud, to hear the words escape my chest instead of festering inside. When I finished, Ethan leaned back, shaking his head. Man. I don't even know what to say. Yeah, I replied, taking a long sip of the beer. Me neither. The thing about betrayal is that it's not just the act, it's the ripple effect. It makes you question everything. Was she lying during that vacation last summer when she said she missed me while I was at work? Was every "I love you" just part of a routine she outgrew? The next morning, I woke up on Ethan's couch with a stiff neck and a mind still heavy with questions. My phone buzzed on the coffee table. Megan again. Megan, can we talk? Pleased that I stared at the message, my stomach churning. Part of me wanted to ignore her, let her sit with the mess she'd made. But another part of me, stubborn, curious, maybe even masochistic, wanted answers. So I replied. Me, I'll be home at 6. Don't have him there. I didn't know what I was hoping to accomplish. Maybe closure. Maybe just the satisfaction of seeing her squirm under the weight of her own guilt. When I walked into the house that evening, Megan was sitting at the kitchen table, her hands wrapped around a mug like it could anchor her. She looked up, her eyes puffy like she'd been crying. I didn't feel sorry for her. Not even a little. I sat down across from her, arms crossed. Talk. She took a shaky breath. I'm sorry, James. I stared at her, waiting for more. An explanation. A reason. But she just sat there, like sorry was supposed to fix everything. That's it? I asked, my voice low. You blew up our marriage, and all you've got is, I'm sorry? Her eyes filled with tears. I didn't mean for it to happen. I laughed, shaking my head. That's what people say when they accidentally break a plate, Megan. You made choices. Over and over. She reached for my hand, but I pulled back. I was unhappy. She whispered. So you cheat instead of talking to me? She didn't answer. Just sat there, staring at the table like it held the answers she couldn't find. I stood up, my heart pounding. I'm filing for divorce. She looked up, her face crumpling. James, please, no, I cut her off. You made your choice. This is mine. And with that, I walked out. This time, I knew exactly where I was going, forward. The door slammed behind me with a finality that echoed louder than the argument itself. This wasn't one of those fights where you storm out, cool off, and come back with apologies and promises. No, this was different. This was the moment when the life I'd built with Megan cracked beyond repair. I didn't drive this time. I just walked. The cool evening air felt sharp against my skin, but it kept me grounded, each step pounding the pavement like I was trying to stomp out the memories that flooded my mind. Every little detail hit me, the way she laughed when we first met, the vows we exchanged, the quiet mornings over coffee, all of it tainted now, rewritten with the knowledge of her betrayal. I ended up at a small park near our neighborhood. The benches were empty, the playground abandoned, the only sound the faint rustle of leaves. I sat down, staring at nothing, my thoughts racing. How did we get here? We weren't always like this. There was a time when Megan looked at me like I was her entire world. We'd lie in bed talking about the future, imagining kids, a bigger house, vacations we never took. But somewhere along the line, that version of us faded, replaced by routines and unspoken resentment. The thing is, I thought we were just going through a phase. That's what couples do, right? They hit rough patches, they work through them. I didn't think she'd hit a rough patch and decide to screw her dentist. My phone buzzed again. Megan, I know I messed up. I don't want to lose you. I stared at the message, feeling nothing. No anger, no sadness. Just exhaustion. She'd already lost me the moment she let him into our bed that I didn't reply. Instead, I went back to Ethan's. He opened the door, took one look at me, and didn't ask questions. Just handed me another beer and let me sit in silence. That's the thing about good friends, they don't force you to talk. They just sit there with you, waiting for you to find the words when you're ready. I told her I want a divorce, I finally muttered. Ethan nodded like he expected that. Good. It was such a simple word, good, but it hit me harder than I expected. Because it was good. It was the right decision. But that didn't make it easy. The next few days were a blur of logistics. I stayed with Ethan while I figured things out. I went back to the house only when I knew Megan wasn't there, grabbing clothes, important documents, anything that felt like mine. Funny how little that turned out to be. You spend years building a life with someone, and when it falls apart, you realize most of it was just stuff. The real weight is in the memories that I found an apartment across town, small, with creaky floors and terrible lighting, but it was mine. No echoes of betrayal in the walls, no reminders of Megan in the corners. Filing for divorce was strangely anticlimactic. A few signatures, a lot of legal jargon, and just like that, years of marriage reduced to paperwork. Megan tried to reach out a few times, texts, calls, even showing up at my new place once. I didn't answer. There was nothing left to say, but the silence didn't bring peace right away. It brought something else, grief. Not just for the marriage, but for the future I thought we had. I grieved the kids we never had, the vacations we never took, the life that existed only in our plans. That I spent a lot of nights alone, staring at the ceiling, wondering if I'd missed the signs. If I could have done something differently. Was I too focused on work? Did I stop showing her I cared? But no matter how many times I ran through it, the answer was always the same: she made a choice, not once. Not by accident. But over and over. And now, I was making mine. One night, I found myself flipping through an old notebook Megan had given me when we first got married. It was supposed to be for our adventures, she'd said. Most of the pages were blank, except for a few scribbles from random trips. I stared at the empty pages, realizing they were a perfect metaphor for our marriage, a lot of promise, not much substance. That I picked up a pen and wrote, "This isn't the end. It's the beginning of me." And for the first time since it all fell apart, I believed it. The days after filing for divorce felt like a blur, like watching my life from the outside, disconnected from everything I once knew. The paperwork was just ink on paper, but the reality? That hit harder. The house Megan and I picked out together, the framed photos I'd walked past every morning, the smell of her perfume lingering in the closet I'd left behind, they haunted me in ways I wasn't prepared for. I thought walking away would be the hardest part. It wasn't. Staying gone was. I moved into a small one-bedroom apartment across town. The walls were plain, the furniture mismatched, some stuff I grabbed from storage, some cheap finds from thrift shops. There was no warmth, no history. But that was the point. It was mine, untouched by memories of Megan or the life we'd shared. The first night alone was the worst. The silence was deafening, broken only by the occasional creak of the old floorboards. I sat on the edge of the bed, staring at the blank walls, feeling a hollowness in my chest I couldn't explain. It wasn't loneliness, not exactly. It was like grief, but not for a person. I was grieving an idea, the version of my life I thought I had. I found myself scrolling through old photos on my phone, vacations, holidays, random selfies with Megan. We looked happy in those pictures. But now, all I could see were the cracks I'd missed, the forced smiles, the distance hidden behind candid poses. I deleted them all, one by one. It felt like ripping off a band-aid, quick, sharp, necessary. But no matter how many photos I deleted, the memories stayed. I went back to work, trying to lose myself in routine. Meetings, deadlines, emails, it all felt pointless. My co-workers noticed I was off, but no one asked. I think they could tell I was one wrong question away from breaking. Ethan checked in regularly. He'd swing by with beers, drag me out to grab food, even if I wasn't hungry. He didn't push me to talk, just filled the silence when I couldn't point. One night, after a few too many drinks, I finally broke. "I don't get it," I muttered, staring into my half-empty glass. "How do you go from loving someone to this?" Ethan didn't have an answer. Just sat there, nodding, like he understood. Maybe he did. Or maybe he just knew there was no answer. The truth hit me then, there was no closure waiting for me. No magical moment of clarity. No explanation from Megan that would make it all make sense. The only thing I could control was how I moved forward. So, I started small. I signed up for a gym membership, not to get back at her or whatever cliché revenge narrative people like to push. I just needed something to focus on. Something physical to get me out of my own head. I picked up old hobbies I'd abandoned during my marriage, photography, hiking, things I'd convinced myself I was too busy for. Turns out, I wasn't too busy. I was just living a life that didn't have room for me in it, and slowly, I started to feel something, not happiness. Not yet. But relief that I didn't have to pretend anymore. That I wasn't stuck in a marriage where love felt like an obligation rather than a choice. One evening, I sat on my tiny balcony, the city lights blinking in the distance, and realized something simple but profound. I wasn't missing her. I was missing the version of myself I'd lost trying to hold on to someone who had already let go, and that version of me, I was ready to find him again. Time doesn't heal everything, but it does create distance. Enough distance to see things clearly, to separate what happened from what you felt about it. Weeks turned into months, and slowly, the sharp edges of Megan's betrayal dulled. They didn't disappear, they just stopped cutting me open every time I thought about it. I filled my days with distractions. Work was easier now because it gave me something to control, something to pour my energy into without the emotional minefield of my personal life. The gym became a routine, not a coping mechanism. I wasn't chasing revenge fitness or trying to prove anything. I just liked the way it made me feel, strong, steady, grounded. But nights were harder. That's when the silence crept in, wrapping around me like a blanket I couldn't shake off. I'd lie in bed, staring at the ceiling, wondering if Megan ever thought about me. Not because I missed her, I didn't. I just wanted to know if she regretted it. If I ever crossed her mind in the same way she haunted mine, even if just for a second. I never reached out. I never responded to her occasional texts, the half-hearted, "I hope you're doing okay" messages she sent like breadcrumbs scattered along the path she burned. I didn't need her guilt. It couldn't undo what she'd done. One day, I ran into her. Of course, it had to be at the most mundane place, the grocery store. I was grabbing coffee, she was in the same aisle, standing there like a ghost from a past life, debating between two brands of almond milk. Our eyes met. A flicker of recognition. A flicker of something. She smiled, polite, distant, the kind you give to strangers. "Hey, James," she said, her voice softer than I remembered. I nodded. "Megan." Awkward silence stretched between us, filled with all the things we weren't saying. I didn't feel the rush of anger I expected. No tightness in my chest. Just nothing. She was just a person I used to know, standing under harsh fluorescent lights. "How have you been?" she asked, like we were old friends catching up. I shrugged. "Good." And I meant it. She hesitated, like she wanted to say more, but I didn't give her the chance. I nodded again, turned around, and walked away. No dramatic exit. No lingering glances. Just me, reclaiming the last piece of myself she didn't get to keep. When I got home, I sat on my couch, in my apartment, surrounded by things that had no ties to her, and realized something profound. I was free, not just from her, but from the version of me that thought I needed her. That night, I opened a fresh notebook. Not the old one filled with heartbreak and bitterness. This was new, blank pages, no baggage. I wrote, she was a chapter, not the whole story. And for the first time since it all fell apart, I felt ready to write the next page. After running into Megan at the grocery store, something shifted inside me. It wasn't dramatic, like some life-altering epiphany you'd see in movies. It was subtle, like realizing the weight you've been carrying for so long had quietly slipped off your shoulders when you weren't looking. I didn't think about her as much after that. No more replaying old arguments or dissecting every memory, searching for the exact moment things went wrong. It didn't matter anymore. The past had already happened. What mattered now was what I did with the pieces she left behind. That I focused on myself, not in the cliché, new me, revenge body, kind of way, but genuinely. I went back to hobbies I'd abandoned when I was too busy being someone's husband. Photography became my therapy. There was something about looking through a lens, framing the world one shot at a time, that made me feel present. It forced me to focus on the beauty in small things, sunsets, city lights, people laughing in cafes, things I'd overlooked when my mind was drowning in Betrayal. One weekend, I signed up for a photography workshop downtown. It wasn't planned. I saw a flyer while grabbing coffee and thought, why not? That's where I met Rachel. She wasn't like Megan. Where Megan had this polished, controlled perfection about her, Rachel was effortless. Wavy, untamed hair, a crooked smile that didn't care about being flawless, and a laugh that wasn't rehearsed. She was flipping through her camera settings, muttering about how she could never figure out the lighting adjustments. That I chuckled, leaning over slightly. Need a hand? She glanced up, squinting against the sun, and smiled. Only if you promise not to make fun of me for being technologically challenged. That's how it started. A simple conversation about camera settings turned into coffee after the workshop, which turned into walks around the city, comparing photos, laughing at our terrible attempts at artsy shots. With Rachel, there was no pressure. No expectations. She didn't know me as the guy whose wife cheated on him. She didn't know Megan existed. I wasn't someone's ex-husband in her eyes. I was just James, the guy who liked photography and hated pineapple on pizza. We didn't jump into anything romantic right away. It was just easy companionship, and for the first time in a long time, I wasn't trying to impress anyone. I could just be. But feelings have a way of sneaking up on you when you least expect them. One evening, we were sitting on the rooftop of her apartment, watching the city lights flicker against the dark sky. She passed me a cup of lukewarm coffee, and we sat in comfortable silence for a while. Then she asked, "So, what's your story?" I hesitated. It was the first time anyone had asked me that since the divorce without already knowing the answer. Part of me wanted to keep it light, to avoid the heavy stuff. But something about Rachel made me feel like I didn't have to hide. So, I told her. I didn't sugarcoat it. I told her about Megan, the affair, walking in on her with the dentist. Yeah, that detail still sounded ridiculous even saying it out loud. The divorce, the loneliness, the anger, all of it. I expected Rachel to react with sympathy or awkwardness, but she just listened, nodding occasionally, sipping her coffee. When I finished, she didn't say, "I'm so sorry," or offer some cliché advice. She just smiled softly and said, "Well, sounds like you dodged a bullet." I stared at her, surprised, then laughed, a real, genuine laugh I hadn't felt in months. "Yeah," I said, shaking my head. "I guess I did." She nudged me with her shoulder. "And look at you now. Free to eat all the bad takeout and take blurry photos without anyone judging." We sat there for a while longer, and for the first time since everything fell apart, I felt peace, not the forced kind where you pretend you're okay. Real peace. The kind that comes from knowing you've been through hell and made it out the other side. Over the next few weeks, Rachel and I grew closer. It wasn't dramatic or rushed. Just natural. She wasn't my rebound. She was my reminder that life doesn't end when someone leaves you. Sometimes, it actually begins. One night, we were walking back to my apartment after dinner, and she stopped suddenly, looking up at the sky. "Isn't it crazy," she said, "how the stars are always there, even when we can't see them?" I looked at her, then up at the night sky. "Yeah," I replied. "Kind of like happiness." She smiled, her hand finding mine, and in that moment, I realized, I wasn't just surviving anymore. I was living. Life has a way of surprising you, not with grand, cinematic moments, but with quiet realizations that sneak up on you when you're not paying attention. That's how it was with Rachel. There was no dramatic revelation, no sudden burst of fireworks. It was simpler than that, softer. Like realizing one day that the ache in your chest isn't there anymore. We spent more time together, not because we had to but because it felt right. We'd go on long walks through the city, cameras in hand, capturing moments that most people would overlook. Streetlights reflecting on wet pavement, old buildings with ivy creeping up the walls, strangers laughing in coffee shops. It wasn't about the photos, it was about the stories behind them, the fragments of life happening all around us. One evening, we ended up back at her place after a spontaneous road trip to a nearby coastal town. We were both exhausted, sand still clinging to our shoes, the salty air lingering in our hair. She made us tea, because apparently, that's what adults do when they're too tired for anything else, and we sat on her tiny balcony, the city lights stretching out like constellations below us. Rachel broke the silence first. Do you ever think about her? The question hung in the air for a moment. Not heavy, not invasive, just curious that I thought about it, really thought about it, not like I used to, I said honestly. She's more of a memory now than a person. Like an old photo tucked in a box somewhere. Rachel nodded, sipping her tea. Memories can be tricky like that. Sometimes they feel heavier than they should. I smiled softly. Not this one. Not anymore. And it was true. Megan had become just a name, a chapter I'd finished reading long ago. The pain wasn't sharp anymore, it was just history. After that night, things with Rachel shifted, not in a dramatic, world-changing way, but in the small, significant ways that matter. We weren't just two people hanging out anymore. We were something. One day, we decided to visit an art exhibit downtown. It was one of those abstract galleries where everything looks like it could be either a masterpiece or an accident. We wandered through the halls, debating the meaning behind splashes of paint and twisted metal sculptures. We stopped in front of a massive canvas, just layers of colors blending together, blues, oranges, hints of gray. Rachel tilted her head, studying it. What do you see? She asked. I stared at it for a while before answering. Chaos. But kind of beautiful chaos. She grinned. I see layers. Like everything messy underneath makes the top part more interesting. I looked at her, realizing she wasn't just talking about the painting. Later, as we walked out of the gallery, she slipped her hand into mine without saying anything. It was such a small gesture, but it felt like the most natural thing in the world. That night, as I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, I realized I wasn't holding on to the past anymore. I wasn't defined by what Megan did or who she left me for. I was just me again. Maybe even a better version of me, someone who had been broken and put back together, piece by piece. I picked up my notebook, the one I'd started after the divorce, filled with messy thoughts and scattered words, and turned to a fresh page. Sometimes, the best chapters come after the worst ones. And you don't even realize you've started them until you're halfway through. I smiled, closed the notebook, and finally, felt whole. Life has this quiet way of moving forward, even when you're not paying attention. You blink, and suddenly the seasons change, the calendar flips, and the person you used to be feels like a stranger. That's how it felt looking back on everything with Megan, like remembering a dream that didn't belong to me anymore. It had been nearly a year since the divorce was finalized when I got the text, Megan, hey, I found some of your old stuff in the attic. Want me to drop it off? For a moment, I just stared at my phone. There was no emotion attached to her name anymore. No anger. No heartbreak. Just, nothing that I thought about ignoring it. But then again, part of me was curious, not about the stuff, but about seeing her one last time. Not for closure, I already had that, but to confirm to myself how far I'd come. So, I replied. Me, sure. I'll swing by tomorrow. The next day, I drove to the house we used to share. It looked the same from the outside, same mailbox, same garden she'd insisted on planting, but it didn't feel like mine anymore. It was just a house, not a home. Megan answered the door, looking different but somehow exactly the same. She'd cut her hair, wore a simple sweater, no makeup. We stood there for a moment, this awkward silence between us like an invisible wall. "Hey," she said softly. "Hey," I replied, my voice steady. She handed me a box, old books, some photo albums, random trinkets I'd forgotten existed. "That's it," she said, forcing a smile. "Thanks," I replied, shifting the box in my arms that I turned to leave, but she spoke again. "James, can we talk?" I hesitated, then nodded. "Sure." We sat at the kitchen table, the same spot where we used to plan vacations and argue about bills. It felt surreal. She cleared her throat. "I just wanted to say I'm sorry. Not for, everything," she stumbled, "but for how I handled it. You didn't deserve that." I looked at her, realizing how small her apology felt now. "Not because it wasn't sincere, but because I didn't need it, I know," I said simply. She blinked, probably expecting more. "I thought about what I'd say to you if we ever had this conversation," I continued. "But the truth is, I don't feel anything about it anymore. I'm not angry. I'm not hurt. I'm just over it." She nodded slowly, her eyes dropping to the table. "I guess I hoped we could be friends." I gave a small smile. "We were never friends, Megan. We were a couple. And now we're not." She didn't argue. Just sat there, quietly absorbing my words. That I stood up, grabbing the box. "Take care of yourself." And that was it. No dramatic goodbye. No lingering feelings. Just two people who shared a chapter, now living separate stories. When I got back to my apartment, Rachel was there, flipping through one of her photography books. She looked up and smiled, her eyes lighting up in that way I'd grown to love. "How'd it go?" she asked. That I set the box down, shrugged. "It was nothing, really." She nodded, not pressing for more. That's what I loved about her. She never tried to fix things that weren't broken. Later that night, as we sat on the couch, her head resting on my shoulder, I thought about how far I'd come. Not just from Megan, but from the version of myself that thought I needed someone else to be whole. That I reached for my notebook, flipping to the last page. Some endings aren't tragic. They're just necessary. I closed it for the final time, realizing I didn't need to write in it anymore, because I was no longer living in the aftermath of a story. That I was writing a new one. It's strange how life's biggest lessons come quietly, without fanfare. No dramatic background music, no slow-motion epiphanies, just small, steady moments that eventually add up to something meaningful. Months passed after that last encounter with Megan, and her face slowly faded into the background of my memory, like an old photograph tucked away in a drawer. It wasn't anger that kept her distant in my mind, it was indifference. I didn't hate her. I didn't even really miss her. She was just part of a life I no longer lived. Rachel and I grew closer with time. There was no rush, no pressure to define what we were. It wasn't about filling the space Megan left behind. There was no space to fill. Rachel wasn't a replacement, she was simply a new chapter, one that felt genuine, free from the weight of the past. One evening, we found ourselves on a quiet beach, cameras in hand, watching the sun melt into the horizon. The sky was a canvas of oranges and pinks, the waves whispering secrets only the ocean knows. Rachel lowered her camera and looked at me. "Do you ever think about how it all started? The divorce, Megan, everything?" I thought about it for a moment, the breeze tugging at my thoughts like invisible fingers. "Yeah," I said honestly. "But it feels like someone else's story now." She nodded, her fingers brushing against mine, not asking for more. She didn't need to. That's the thing about healing, it's not about forgetting. It's about remembering without it hurting anymore. When we got home that night, I found my old notebook tucked away in a drawer. The pages were filled with messy handwriting, frustration, heartbreak, anger, and eventually, acceptance. I flipped through it, reading bits and pieces, feeling like I was revisiting someone else's life. Then I turned to the last blank page. I picked up a pen and wrote, "This isn't the end of the story. It's just the end of the part where I thought I was broken." I closed the notebook, smiled to myself, and placed it back in the drawer, not because I needed it anymore, but because it was part of my journey. And as I turned off the light, Rachel's laughter echoing from the other room, I realized something simple but profound. Sometimes the most beautiful stories aren't the ones we plan, they're the ones we live.